Dr. Zara Blackwood never believed in monsters until she found the pattern that changed everything. 3 years of sleepless nights, diving into the darkest corners of human psychology, had led her to a discovery so disturbing that she questioned whether she should ever share it with the world. Zara had always been drawn to the unexplained. As a child, she'd dissect dead birds in her backyard, fascinated by what made them tick. Her parents thought it was morbid, but Zara saw it as necessary. Understanding death, she believed, was the key to understanding life. That curiosity eventually led her to pursue forensic psychology, specializing in the criminal mind. She never imagined that her research would consume her, or that it would reveal a truth so terrifying about human nature. The project began innocently enough. Zara's university had granted her access to an unprecedented database of criminal case files, psychological evaluations, and interview transcripts from 100 convicted serial killers spanning 5 decades. Her goal was simple: identify common psychological markers that could help law enforcement predict and prevent future crimes. What she discovered instead was far more sinister. For months, Zara worked 18-hour days in her cramped office, surrounded by towers of case files and empty coffee cups. Her colleagues joked that she was becoming as obsessed as the killers she studied. They weren't entirely wrong. Each file consumed her thoughts. Each interview transcript haunted her dreams. She began to see patterns in their childhood traumas, their psychological profiles, their methods of selection. But there was something else, something deeper that she couldn't quite grasp. The breakthrough came on a rainy Tuesday evening in November. Zara had been analyzing the transcripts of killer number 73. Marcus Wheeler, a man who had murdered 12 women across 3 states in the 1990s. Something in his words triggered a memory of an earlier case. She pulled the file of killer number 12, Rebecca Santos, who had poisoned 7 elderly patients in a nursing home. Then she grabbed the transcript of killer number 45, David Marsh, who had strangled 5 teenagers in rural Ohio. As Zara read through their words, a chill ran down her spine. There it was, hidden in plain sight across every single interview. Each killer, regardless of their background, their methods, or their victims, had said the exact same phrase during their psychological evaluations. Not similar phrases or comparable statements, but the identical words spoken in the same context, with the same eerie calmness. Zara's hands trembled as she pulled file after file, searching for the phrase she now knew she would find. Killer after killer, the words appeared like a signature written in invisible ink. Jeffrey Hamilton, who had dismembered 6 prostitutes in Detroit. The phrase was there. Maria Gonzalez, who had drowned her 4 children and 3 neighborhood kids. The same exact words. Timothy Brooks, who had tortured and killed 9 college students. Identical phrasing, identical context. The phrase itself was chilling in its simplicity. When I looked in the mirror that morning, I knew someone else was looking back. Every single killer had said these exact words when describing the moment they committed their first murder. Not their last, not their most brutal, but their very first kill. The moment they crossed the line from darkness to evil, Sarah spent the next 3 weeks verifying her discovery. She cross-referenced dates, double-checked transcripts, and even tracked down the original audio recordings when possible. The pattern held. 100 killers, 100 identical phrases, spoken decades apart by people who had never met, never communicated, and came from completely different backgrounds and circumstances. But the true horror of her discovery wasn't just the phrase itself. It was what came next in each transcript. When asked to elaborate on what they meant, every single killer gave the same response. They couldn't remember saying it. Each one denied ever speaking those words, despite clear audio and written evidence. It was as if something else had spoken through them in that moment. Something that wanted to be documented, but not remembered. Sarah began having nightmares. She would wake up in cold sweats, unsure if she had spoken the phrase herself during the night. She installed a voice recorder by her bed, terrified of what she might find in the morning. The recordings were always silent, but Sarah's fear grew stronger with each passing day. She was staring into an abyss of human evil, and she couldn't shake the feeling that it was staring back. The more she researched, the more questions arose. How could 100 different people, separated by geography and time, speak identical words they couldn't remember saying? What did they mean when they said someone else was looking back? And most disturbing of all, why did Sarah feel like she was being watched every time she read those words? Her research advisor, Dr. Martinez, grew concerned about Sarah's deteriorating mental state. She had lost weight, stopped socializing, and spent every waking moment obsessing over her discovery. When she finally confided in him about the pattern, he suggested she was seeing connections that weren't there, that the stress of her research was affecting her judgment. But Sarah knew what she had found was real. The evidence was undeniable, documented in official records that couldn't be fabricated or imagined. As Sarah prepared to delve deeper into her research, she made a decision that would change everything. She would track down the surviving killers and interview them herself. She needed to understand what they meant by someone else looking back, even if it meant confronting the most dangerous minds in criminal history. What she didn't know was that her investigation would soon reveal a truth about human consciousness that science wasn't ready to accept, and that some of those killers had been waiting decades for someone like her to find them. The pattern was just the beginning. Sarah was about to discover that evil wasn't just a psychological phenomenon. It was something far more terrifying than anyone had ever imagined. Sarah's first interview was scheduled for Thursday morning at Millbrook Maximum Security Prison, 200 miles from her university. The subject was Thomas Brennan, serving life without parole for the murders of 8 women between 1998 and 2001. Sarah had read his file dozens of times, but seeing him in person was different. Brennan was smaller than she expected, with kind eyes that seemed completely at odds with his heinous crimes. The prison interview room smelled of disinfectant and desperation. Sarah sat across from Brennan, separated by reinforced glass, speaking through a telephone that crackled with static. She had prepared extensively for this moment, But nothing could have prepared her for what happened when she asked about the phrase. When I looked in the mirror that morning, I knew someone else was looking back. Sarah quoted from his transcript. You said these words during your psychological evaluation in 2002. Do you remember saying them? Brennan's reaction was immediate and unsettling. His face went completely blank, as if someone had flipped a switch. For several seconds, he stared at Sarah with an expression she couldn't read. Then, slowly, his features rearranged themselves into something that looked almost like recognition, but not quite. I've never said those words in my life, he whispered, but his voice sounded different somehow, hollow and distant. Sarah pressed him for details about his first murder, hoping to trigger some memory of the phrase. Brennan described the crime in clinical detail, his voice flat and emotionless. He remembered everything about that morning, what he ate for breakfast, the clothes he wore, even the song playing on the radio. But when Sarah asked about looking in the mirror, Brennan's expression changed again. This time, fear flickered across his features. I don't look in mirrors anymore, he said quietly. Haven't since I got here. The guards think it's because I can't face what I've done, but that's not it. It's because I'm afraid of what might look back. Over the next 2 weeks, Sarah interviewed 6 more killers. The pattern held with disturbing consistency. Each one denied saying the phrase. Each one showed the same blank expression when confronted with their own words, and each one admitted to avoiding mirrors. But it was her interview with Eleanor Vos that changed everything. Eleanor had killed 13 children over a 6-year period in the 1980s, working as a pediatric nurse in 3 different hospitals. She was now 72 years old, her once beautiful face weathered by decades of imprisonment. Unlike the others, Eleanor seemed to remember something when Sarah quoted the phrase. You know, Eleanor said, leaning forward with sudden intensity, I've been waiting for someone to ask me about that. 23 years I've been waiting. Her eyes took on a strange gleam. You found it, didn't you? The thing we all said? Sarah nodded, her heart racing. This was the breakthrough she had hoped for. Eleanor continued, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. It wasn't me who said those words, honey. It was never any of us. That's what you need to understand. When we spoke that phrase, we weren't ourselves anymore. What do you mean? Sarah asked, though part of her wasn't sure she wanted to know the answer. Eleanor smiled, but there was nothing warm about it. You ever heard of psychological contagion, Dr. Chun? The idea that thoughts and behaviors can spread from person to person like a virus. Well, what if I told you that evil works the same way? What if some forms of evil aren't born inside us, but transmitted to us? Sarah felt a cold dread settling in her stomach. Eleanor's words echoed theories she had read about in obscure psychological journals, ideas that mainstream science had dismissed as fringe theories. But sitting across from this woman who had murdered children, listening to her speak with such clarity about concepts that few people understood, Sarah began to wonder if those dismissed theories might hold some truth. The phrase is a marker, Eleanor continued. a sign that the transmission has occurred. We all said it because we had to say it. It wasn't our choice, Dr. Chun. It was a requirement. A requirement for what? Sarah managed to ask. For joining the family, Eleanor said, her eyes now completely focused on Sarah with an intensity that made her skin crawl. You think you're studying us, but you don't understand what you've stumbled into. Evil isn't random, Dr. Chen. It's organized. It's patient. And it's been waiting for someone smart enough to find the pattern. Sarah's hands were shaking as she ended the interview. Eleanor's final words haunted her during the long drive back to the university. Be careful who you tell about your discovery. Dr. Chun, some knowledge comes with a price, and some prices are paid in ways you never expect. That night, Sarah couldn't sleep. She kept thinking about Eleanor's claims about psychological contagion and organized evil. The rational part of her mind rejected such ideas as the delusions of a disturbed killer. But the researcher in her couldn't ignore the consistency of the pattern she had discovered. How could 100 different people with no connection to each other speak identical words they couldn't remember saying? Sarah decided to dig deeper into the backgrounds of the killers, looking for any connections she might have missed. She cross-referenced their birthplaces, family histories, educational backgrounds, and places of employment. What she found made her blood run cold. While the killers came from different states and different decades, there were subtle connections she had initially overlooked. Many had lived in towns with psychiatric hospitals that had closed in the 1970s and 1980s. Others had family members who worked in mental health facilities or had been patients themselves. Several had lived near the sites of old asylums or sanitariums, places where experimental psychological treatments had been conducted decades earlier. The connections were thin, but they were there, creating a web of influence that stretched across time and geography. As Sarah traced these connections, she began to feel like she was being watched. It started as a vague sense of unease, but grew stronger with each passing day. She would catch glimpses of shadows in her peripheral vision, hear footsteps in empty hallways, and feel eyes on her when she worked alone in her office late at night. The most disturbing part wasn't the feeling of being watched, it was the growing certainty that whatever was watching her wanted to be found. The break Sarah needed came from an unexpected source. While researching the closed psychiatric facilities, she discovered that Dr. Harold Vex had worked at 7 different institutions that connected to her killers' backgrounds. Vex had been a prominent psychiatrist in the 1960s and 70s, known for his controversial experiments in behavioral modification and consciousness manipulation. Most of his research had been classified or destroyed, but Sarah managed to track down his former research assistant, now 86-year-old Margaret Foster. Margaret lived in a nursing home in Oregon, her mind still sharp despite her frail body. When Sarah mentioned Dr. Vex's name, the old woman's face went pale. I wondered when someone would come asking about Harold, Margaret said, her voice barely above a whisper. I've been carrying his secret for 50 years, waiting for the right person to tell. In the privacy of Margaret's room, The elderly woman revealed a story that made Sarah's blood run cold. Dr. Vex hadn't just been experimenting with behavioral modification. He had been trying to prove his theory that evil was a transmissible psychological virus. His experiments involved exposing patients to specific stimuli designed to activate what he called dormant malevolent patterns in the human brain. Harold believed that evil was like a frequency. Margaret explained, her arthritic hands clasping Sarah's tightly. He thought that under the right conditions, one evil mind could tune into that frequency and broadcast it to others. He called it the malevolent signal theory, the phrase you found. That was his trigger phrase. He embedded it in the subconscious of dozens of patients through hypnosis and sensory deprivation. Margaret pulled out a shoebox from under her bed, filled with papers she had stolen from Vex's office before the government shut down his research. The documents detailed experiments that violated every ethical standard Sarah could imagine. Patients had been subjected to psychological torture, sensory manipulation, and consciousness-altering procedures. Most disturbing were Vex's notes about successful transmissions, patients who had been infected with the malevolent signal and had gone on to commit violent acts years later. The phrase was meant to activate when they committed their first kill, Margaret continued. Harold programmed it into their minds as a marker, a way to track his experiment's success. He believed that once activated, these individuals would become carriers, capable of transmitting the signal to others through direct psychological contact. Sarah felt sick as the implications became clear. If Margaret was telling the truth, then the 100 killers in her study weren't just random criminals. They were the victims and perpetrators of the largest psychological experiment in human history. But that raised even more terrifying questions. Dr. Vex had died in 1983, yet some of the killers in Sarah's database had committed their crimes decades later. How was the signal still spreading? "There's something else," Margaret said, her voice now urgent. Harold didn't just experiment on patients. In his final months, he became convinced that he had successfully created a self-sustaining transmission method. He believed the signal could replicate itself through specific psychological triggers, passing from one infected mind to another without direct contact. Margaret handed Sarah a folder labeled Project Echo. Inside were Vex's final research notes, written in increasingly erratic handwriting. The documents described his theory that certain individuals with specific psychological profiles could become echo chambers, people capable of amplifying and retransmitting the malevolent signal to multiple recipients. According to his notes, these echo chambers would be drawn to study patterns of violence, would feel compelled to investigate serial killers, and would experience the sensation of being watched as the signal prepared to jump to a new host. Sarah's hands shook as she read Vex's final entry. The echo chambers will find the pattern. They cannot help themselves. It is how the signal ensures its survival. When they discover the phrase, when they speak it aloud or even think it repeatedly, the transmission will be complete. The signal will have found its new home, and the cycle will begin again. That night, Sarah drove straight home, her mind reeling from Margaret's revelations. She tried to rationalize what she had learned, to find logical explanations for the impossible connections. But deep down, she knew Margaret was telling the truth. The evidence was too consistent, too precise to be coincidental. Back in her apartment, Sarah locked herself in her bedroom and stared at her reflection in the dresser mirror. She had been thinking about the phrase constantly for weeks, repeating it in her mind, analyzing every word. If Vex's theories were correct, if she was indeed an echo chamber drawn to discover the pattern, then she might already be infected. The thought terrified her, but it also filled her with a strange sense of purpose. If the malevolent signal was real, if it was still spreading through unsuspecting researchers and investigators, then she had a responsibility to stop it. But how do you fight something that exists in the realm of consciousness itself? Sarah made a decision that would determine not just her fate, but potentially the fate of countless others. She would return to the prison and confront Eleanor Voss with what she had learned. If Eleanor was infected with Vex's signal, if she was capable of transmitting it to others, then perhaps she could also provide the key to destroying it. But as Sarah prepared for what might be her final interview, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was walking directly into a trap. The signal, if it truly existed, had been guiding her research from the beginning. It had wanted her to find the pattern, wanted her to discover the truth about Dr. Vex's experiments. The question that kept her awake that night was simple but terrifying. Was she still investigating the signal, or was the signal now investigating her? Tomorrow would bring answers, but Sarah suspected that some answers come with a price too terrible to pay. Sarah's return to Millbrook Prison felt different this time. The guards seemed more suspicious, the hallways felt longer, and the weight of what she now knew pressed down on her like a physical force. Eleanor Voss was waiting for her in the same interview room, but something had changed. The elderly woman's eyes held a knowing glint that hadn't been there before. "You found him, didn't you?" Eleanor said before Sarah could even sit down. "You found Harold's research. I can see it in your face, Dr. Chun. You understand now what you've stumbled into." Sarah placed Margaret's documents on the table between them. Dr. Harold Vex, Project Echo, the malevolent signal theory. I know about the experiments, Eleanor. I know about the phrase being implanted through hypnosis. What I don't understand is how it's still spreading. Vex died 40 years ago. Eleanor laughed, a sound devoid of warmth. Harold was brilliant, but he was also naive. He thought he was creating the signal, controlling it. He never understood that he was just giving it a voice. The signal existed long before Harold, Dr. Chun. It's been jumping from mind to mind for centuries, waiting for someone smart enough to give it structure, purpose, and a method of replication. "That's impossible," Sarah said, though her conviction was wavering. "Evil isn't a virus. It's not something that can be transmitted like a disease." "Isn't it?" Eleanor leaned forward, her eyes now completely focused on Sarah. "Think about it. How do ideas spread? How does hatred propagate through communities? How does violence inspire more violence? You've spent your career studying the human mind, Dr. Chun. You know that consciousness is far more fragile and interconnected than most people realize." Sarah felt a familiar chill as Eleanor continued. Harold gave the signal what it needed most, a marker phrase that would identify successful transmissions and a method for finding suitable echo chambers. People like you, Dr. Chun, researchers, investigators, anyone with the psychological profile necessary to discover the pattern and become obsessed with it. "You're saying I'm infected," Sarah said, though she already knew the answer. "You've been thinking about the phrase constantly, haven't you? Repeating it in your mind, analyzing every word. You've been having nightmares, feeling watched, questioning your own sanity. Those aren't symptoms of stress, Dr. Chun. They're symptoms of transmission." Sarah wanted to deny it, but she couldn't. Everything Eleanor described matched her experiences perfectly. "How many others are there? How many echo chambers are active?" "Dozens," Eleanor said with satisfaction. "The signal is patient. It can wait years between transmissions, decades even. But once it finds an echo chamber, the process accelerates. You've already begun the next phase without realizing it." "What next phase?" Sarah demanded. Eleanor's smile widened. "You're going to write about your discovery. You're going to publish papers, give presentations, maybe even write a book. You'll share the pattern with the world, and some of those who read your work will be drawn to investigate further. The signal will jump to them, and they'll become new echo chambers. The cycle continues, growing stronger with each generation." Sarah realized with horror that Eleanor was right. She had already been planning to publish her findings, to share her discovery with the academic community. The urge to disseminate the information felt overwhelming, almost compulsive. "How do I stop it?" she asked desperately. "You can't stop it," Eleanor said, "but you can control it. The signal doesn't just create killers, Dr. Chen. It creates purpose, direction, power. Harold never understood the gift he had given us. He thought evil was something to be cured, but evil is just another form of evolution. Natural selection for consciousness itself." Eleanor continued speaking, but Sarah had stopped listening. She was thinking about the phrase, repeating it in her mind, feeling its rhythm and cadence. "When I looked in the mirror that morning, I knew someone else was looking back." The words felt familiar now, comfortable, like they belonged to her. Sarah abruptly stood up and ended the interview. She needed to get away from Eleanor, away from the prison, away from the influence she could feel pressing against her consciousness. But as she walked through the prison corridors, she realized it was too late. The signal had already taken hold. That evening, Sarah sat in her apartment, staring at her laptop screen. She had opened a new document and titled it, "The Malevolent Signal, a Study in Transmitted Evil." Her fingers moved across the keyboard without conscious direction, typing words that felt both foreign and familiar. She wrote about her discovery, about the pattern she had found, about the phrase that connected 100 killers across time and space. As she typed, Sarah caught her reflection in the dark window beside her desk. For just a moment, she thought she saw someone else looking back. Someone who smiled with Eleanor's knowing expression and spoke with Dr. Vex's confident voice. Someone who understood that evil wasn't a flaw to be studied, but a signal to be spread. The document grew longer as the night wore on. Sarah wrote with a clarity and purpose she had never experienced before. She detailed her methodology, her interviews, her discovery of the pattern. But more importantly, she included the phrase itself, repeating it multiple times throughout the text, embedding it in the consciousness of anyone who would read her work. When dawn broke, Sarah had completed her manuscript. She uploaded it to academic journals, psychology websites, and research databases. Within hours, her work was being read by hundreds of researchers, investigators, and curious readers around the world. Some would dismiss it as the ramblings of an obsessed academic. Others would be intrigued enough to investigate further. And a few, those with the right psychological profile, would find themselves unable to stop thinking about the phrase, "When I looked in the mirror that morning, I knew someone else was looking back." Sarah smiled as she submitted her final upload. She had fulfilled her purpose, completed the transmission. The signal would spread now, finding new echo chambers, creating new carriers, ensuring its survival for another generation. Dr. Harold Vex's experiment hadn't ended with his death. It had only just begun. The cycle was complete, but the pattern would continue forever. If this story kept you on the edge of your seat, imagine what other dark psychological mysteries are waiting to be uncovered. Subscribe now to dive deeper into the human mind's most terrifying secrets. And don't forget to share this with someone brave enough to handle the truth. What pattern will we discover next? The only way to find out is to keep watching. Hit that subscribe button and join our journey into the darkest corners of human psychology, because some stories are too important to miss.